Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. This is Roger Williams, and I am so pleased that you have joined us once again this evening. I think we've got another great show for you this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our guest has to say. Just wanted to give you a few updates. This, of course, is Patriots Week up in Massachusetts. This is the anniversary of the Lexington and Concord. Also down here in New Jersey, we had our Bound Brook reenactment, the Battle of Bound Brook, which occurred in 1777. And we are looking forward to a number of terrific events here in New Jersey, the crossroads of the American Revolution. You go to the events page at the njssar.org. That will give you a whole list of all of the events that we're going to be doing in New Jersey during 2023. Our musical, The Crossing, still is working its way through some of our development phases. Right now, we're looking at putting on an open air production at the Princeton Battlefield over July 4th weekend. We're going to have some of our actors coming to Princeton, and we're going to be playing, they're going to be singing some of the songs from the Crossing musical. You can, of course, hear some of the music from the Crossing just by going to our website, thecrossingmusical.com, and you go to either videos or music, and you can hear some of our music. So those are just a few announcements that wanted to make ahead of time before we get off and running here. I am pleased this evening to introduce our guest, Craig Bruce Smith. Smith is an associate professor of history at the National Defense University in the Joint Advanced Warfighting School in Norfolk, Virginia. He's authored the book on American Honor, The Creation of Nations' Ideals During the Revolutionary Era, which we're going to be talking about this evening. And also he is the co-author of George Washington's Lessons in Ethical Leadership. Smith earned his PhD from American History at Brandeis, and previously was an associate professor military history at the U.S. Army School for Advanced Military Studies. So among some other things, he's had a terrific career, and he's written an absolutely fascinating book. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our guest this evening, Craig Bruce Smith. Welcome to History Author Talk, Craig.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm ready to audition for the Crossing the musical. That's what I'm thinking about right now.
Well, it's an exciting project, and as we were talking before we got show up and running, one of the featured characters in The Crossing is Thomas Paine, and of course, Thomas Paine had his ideals of honor as well, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by this book is that, as many of you know, we spend a lot of time working, talking about books of military history. Then we have a few books that we talk about sometimes about political history of the American Revolution. This is not only political history, but philosophical history of the American Revolution. And so much of what happened during that era had an awful lot to do with how these people thought and felt and what was going through their mind. And that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, Craig, one of the first questions I have for you is, before we start, I just want to remind everyone we are recording this program, so you will be able to come back and look at it on the past programs tab at Author History Talks. And also, if you have a question, just use the little chat feature in the bottom of the Zoom screen there, and those questions will come to me. Now, to my first question.
So since we're doing disclaimers, I just have to get out mine that all views are my own and certainly don't represent anyone but me. So I'm done.
Yeah. When you work for the government, you got to do this kind of stuff. So So Craig, explain the progression of your academic journey that led you to research the topic of 18th century honor and virtue in British America. That's this is so unique, and I'm just curious how you landed on this.
So again, I'm not actually sure how it happened. Where I could point to is I was an undergraduate, and round about the same time, 3 books came out. And it was Caroline Cox's A Proper Sense of Honor, Joanne Freeman's Affairs of Honor, and Judith von Buskirk's Generous Enemies. And they all dealt with honor in different ways. Freeman, about the duel, Generous Enemies, looking at, prisoners of war and ideas of honor there, Proper Sense of Honor, looking at it within the soldiers and officers of the Continental Army. And that was my first real, real experience with this in any sort of depth. And I remember writing a paper on it as an undergrad, and then that sort of like evolved into this just sort of interest. So I went to Brandeis University, where I worked with someone that is definitely going to be known to the Crossing crowd, David Hackett Fisher. And Fisher was all for this project and encouraged it from every step of the way. So the inspiration is probably von Buskirk, Freeman, and Cox, and circa 2000-ish, whatever it was, 2002. But Fisher, and then he introduced me to Bertram Wyatt Brown, who wrote the book Southern Honor. And there's also a lot of Gordon Wood elements in here as well. So I think that really is, those are the origins of it. And then I started the earliest portions of it, I wrote for Fisher. I wrote my first semester graduate paper was on George Washington's honor. Okay. And that sort of, some version of that ended up in the book, kind of sort of chopped and reworked.
Exactly. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So Texas's H.W. Brands recently referred to the American War for Independence as our first Civil War. But British Americans were really a few short generations away from the 17th century First, Second, and Third English Civil Wars. Certainly, there were economic and political issues that brought on the rebellion in America, but can you explain some of the transnational ideals that were embraced by Americans that launched the Fourth English Civil War, which became the American Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, it's the first Civil War that sells a lot of books, right? You slap Civil War anything, that's like 10,000 books.
Yeah.
The Civil War on Crossing the Street or whatever you want sold. So yeah, it sells books. It's good. I get it. I get why they go with that. But yeah, there's a longer tradition of infighting within the British Empire, and this is not far removed. Like you said, the English Civil War of Oliver Cromwell with the Royalists and the Roundheads, or the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This is not that far removed. And for an older founder, someone like Franklin, that's within living memory of people he knew. So it's not really removed. So there are, the American Revolution is very much feeding on this tradition of the Glorious Revolution in many respects. The early aspects of it are quite similar. It's about liberty. It's about natural rights. It's about this new enlightened philosophy, about limitations on monarchs, about rights and liberty. That's all there. And the idea of honor, that's ancient. Honor's been around since as long as there have been people, but how it's been understood has really varied. So in the traditional English or European sense, honor was very much tied to your birth status, and more directly, your relationship to the king. So the closer you were to the king, the more honor you had. It's bestowed by birth. There are, challenges to this in the English Civil War. There are challenges to this in the the Glorious Revolution, but it doesn't destroy the system. There's still, an aristocratic hereditary system in Europe. That really starts to change in America by, we could say, the dates get fuzzy, but circa French and Indian War era.
Right. And it
But
really
it's a long tradition.
And it really was, I mean, what came from the English Civil War was really the birth of the Great Awakening, really, and this idea that man had inherent rights as opposed to just being them just being handed down by heredity.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly a great point, because the idea of the Great Awakening is, whether or not, we could talk about religious significance, and that's a whole other issue. But what, if nothing else, what the Great Awakening does is create a dissenting tradition.
Exactly.
Born out of another dissenting tradition, whereby you can question accepted established ideas, accepted institutions like the Church of England. You could question the king as the head of the Anglican Church. So it's opening up this dissent, it's opening up this questioning, it's opening up the individual sort of interpretation of what is right. And you see individuals like Jonathan Edwards are advancing ideas of sort of a universal morality. So something that exists beyond a sort of denomination. And that's something that really starts to fit in with the sort of American idea of honor and virtue.
So let's talk about we haven't hit the Declaration yet, so I still refer to us as the British Americans. And what was the British American pre-Declaration, pre-war? What was how did their precepts of honor differ from that of the mother country?
So in a lot of ways, they're trying to emulate it in some respect. But the problem is that Americans just can't. There's no aristocracy aside from a few individuals like the Fairfax family. There really are no titled aristocrats in America. The Americans are middling class at best. So even these sort of pseudo aristocrats of, as they often are portrayed, of a Hancock or a Washington or a Jefferson, they're not at the same level as the European counterparts. So a lot of the ideas are trying to be grafted on. And if David Hackett Fisher has a great book, Albion Seed, talking about sort of folkways and how different regions develop different characters based on the migration patterns from the British Isles. And we're going to see that. So if you're in Virginia, it's more of a royalist sense of honor. If you're in New England, there's sort of there are Puritan aspects to it. But by and large, it's very much tied to a birth status. It has a communal aspect, meaning that it's not enough that you think you're honorable. The community has to recognize it. There's a group sort of policing, meaning that the community is deciding, the community is judging.
And a lot of that came from the church.
There's a lot of overlap. And here's the quick rules that I like to go with. So the further north you go, honor and virtue are separate. Virtue is tied to religion. Virtue takes precedence. The further south you go, the words are almost interchangeable.
Interesting.
And what do they actually mean? This is the big question that I'm often asked. So what do you, when you say honor, when you say virtue, what exactly does that mean? So in the 18th century, the word ethics really wasn't used. The only time that word was used, if you were talking about Aristotle, they used words like honor and virtue. So when you hear that word honor and virtue in the 18th century, in your modern ear, think sort of like ethical. But it was very much birth related, in reserved for, at the minimum, the gentry. And who was in the gentry? Someone who was independent by and didn't work with their hands. So that's a really sort of limited pool in America. It starts to change during the French and Indian War as Americans start interacting with the British, and it becomes more merit-based. And this is largely through experiences Americans have with the British Army or with British officials. And this is a pattern we see both with George Washington. It's a pattern we see with Benjamin Franklin. It's their personal experience that starts to get them to understand, well, there's something fundamentally different about how we're interpreting this.
Well, and this also came from the Albany Conference when the colonists started interacting with their other colonists. I mean, before that,
Sure.
they were not really interacting with one another as they, I mean, there were trading partners in Providence and Charleston, and there were, and in Virginia and New York, but it really wasn't until the Albany Conference when they started to really get a sense of national identity.
Or at least a sense of what Americanness as
Yeah.
something distinctive, right? So again, they're still viewing themselves as loyal Britons, but I think you're right that there's a broader sense of American as being something different from a main home island Britain.
Sure. So let's stick with that regionalism.
Sure.
As you mentioned, Bertram Wyatt Brown's book in 1982, Southern Honor. So what was the Southern vision of honor versus New England then, let's say?
Sure. So when Bert Wyatt Brown, he's sort of, if you read any sort of book on honor in the US history, it's going to be tied to his in some way. His book largely is dealing with the run up to the Civil War. And his idea of Southern honor is the sort of stereotypical one we think of when we think of sort of the Confederacy or sort of the Gone with the Wind sort of tradition. And it's one based on status. It's one based on community policing. It's one based on, in a lot of ways, violence and protection of your reputation against all else, defense of women. It's this sort of romanticized and often violent and often brutal notion that's sort of cast in this wider reputation tied to family reputation. So that's what he's speaking of when he says Southern honor. But he has another book it came out, I believe it's The Shaping of Southern Culture. It came out in the 2000s.
Oh.
And he makes a few passing references to honor in the North. And that's basically, it's not a major developed thing. It's like, well, yes, it's there. So that's where I really came at this. And there are differences between what is Northern, what is Southern, what is, mid-Atlantic. It's not a hard and fast. It doesn't stop at a border. It's not, oh, we reached the border of Pennsylvania. That idea must now stop. But the concept of the Southern honor that's often thought about, that's much later. That's 19th century.
Okay.
The 18th century version is very much dealing with a behavior of the idea of how you're behaving for as an individual, for society, for the greater good of society. It's certainly tied to reputation. It can be tied to still the battlefield. There's, dueling is often invoked, but we can get into that either. I would contend that dueling is not honorable. But it's more so, I would say, in the Northern colonies, there's more of a religious aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And honor is considered almost the earthly manifestation of virtue. If you have virtue, as in following a religious morality, honor is bestowed upon you on this earth. You'd rather have virtue. But when you start getting down to the South, getting down to Virginia, they're really becoming more interchangeable. And that's very much the older royalist sentiments of the gentry.
So what I hear you saying though is that the Americans really had to develop their sense of honor, whereas in continental Europe, it was bestowed upon you by your birthright, whereas in America, they have developed these codes of honor?
Well, I would say there's an understanding. There's a very real understanding of honor. I don't think that what develops is they have to develop the concept. They have to develop the institutions around it. What they start to develop is that people can advance themselves in society based on serving society.
So we have a perfect example here. I mean, you in chapter 1, you explore two of our most notable founders, Franklin and Washington, and they first embrace the questions and these concepts of honor and virtue that were practiced in Great Britain. Explain how these two early revolutionary leaders applied those philosophies, the philosophies of the Age of Enlightenment, to translate into this new concept of honor in British America.
So it's very different because Franklin is the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back. He's going to famously say in his autobiography. I see there's a noted Franklin scholar in the audience here, so she'll probably correct me on my paraphrase, but I think I've got it pretty close. He is not born. There is in a British society, there is no way he is viewed as a man of honor. He is not a gentleman. There's no even, his father makes candles and soap. It's impossible. Washington is born into sort of the gentry class, but he is not at the level of a European aristocrat. So they come at it from different ways, but there's a lot of similarity. For one, Franklin reads, and he's coming to his ideas through literature, whether it's a gentleman's magazine or history like Plutarch's Lives or Enlightenment philosophy. He's looking for things that he sees in himself. So he's seizing on ideas of those advancing based on merit. And that's what he's looking to. So by the 1720s, he's developed his own definition of honor, and he calls it ascending honor. And he differentiates this from the European model, which he calls descending honor. So the idea is you gain honor based on who your parents are. He says that honor should be ascending, meaning that the only people that should get honor are those that earn it for themselves or those who taught someone to act that way. So a teacher or a parent. So he comes to this very early on, and he's writing about this in the New England Current in the 1720s. Also, at the same time, he's bashing Harvard as a bunch of blockheads who only know how to take off their hat handsomely, as Silas Dogood. And he doesn't say anything about it until the 1790s. No, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. To the 1780s, when he's sort of railing against the Society of Cincinnati, who I am a big fan of, even though Franklin has his issues. Washington, though, is also, he's reading a lot of the same sources. Washington's also reading novels. One of his favorites is Tom Jones. And there's a line in there that's basically that honor and virtue are synonymous. And he's really following that principle. He also is looking to older male role models, his older half-brother Lawrence, the Fairfax family, who are titled aristocrats, who are nearby Belvoir. So he actually has something to look at. Something to model himself on. He has his path eased forward, and he gets his first job through patronage. It's who you know, not what you know. George, do you want to be a surveyor? Sure. Do you know how to survey? Not really. Sure, the job's yours.
Yeah, I can do that.
Whereas Franklin much more has to make his way, and Franklin's a genius. There's no other way to look at it. But Franklin's searching to find himself in these sort of guides. Washington sees a path forward.
And Washington, I mean, look, these two, paramounts of our founding fathers were, while Franklin and Washington were autodidacts, many of the other founders explored the Enlightenment philosophies in colonial colleges, and you have I think, a terrific chapter where you explain the role of these colleges and what they played in the fomenting of this new vision of honor in British America. Tell us about how many of them preachers, the professors, the teachers in these colleges, how they developed these young minds who became, many of whom became Washington's aide-de-camps or, some of our early leaders.
So it's an interesting thing, because if you're thinking about, not that many people went to college. And it's easy to say colleges, no one went there. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's a really small number. But if you look at that, it's disproportionately those who are the framers of the Constitution, signers of the Declaration of Independence, key leaders disproportionately go to college. In fact, it's Franklin and Washington are the rarities in this sort of circle who don't go. And college is going to expose young men, again, it's only young men at this period, to a lot of the same authors that Washington and Franklin are reading, but it's also going to create an honor culture within the schools. And I'll explain more what I mean about that. So nowadays, students go to school at, roughly 18. Colleges, then you could go much younger. The average age is probably about 15 or 16. So you're much more impressionable. The schools, by and large, all have some semblance of an honor code. They don't necessarily call it that. They don't say, the Harvard honor code. But it's there, the idea that they have to behave in a certain way because their actions, their reputation reflects not just on them, but on the school. And so they're building this sort of collective sense of honor, where it's not just, it's your individual actions, but your individual actions as they reflect on something greater than yourself. And what would they do? Well, there would be lessons in moral philosophy. And there's some big ones. One was by Francis Hutchinson, who was a student of Lord Shaftesbury. And he's very much writing about more of a universal idea of virtue, one that's not necessarily tied to religion. This gets picked up even by religious figures like John Witherspoon, president of College of New Jersey, modern day Princeton. And Witherspoon, what he is actually going to do when he teaches about things like honor and virtue, he has his students, and we have this from his lecture notes, he presents all different interpretations, all different definitions of different ways to understand these terms. And he expects his students to know all the different versions. And his lectures actually get picked up and used at other schools. So King's College or modern day Columbia, they're basically going to adopt his lectures. And so you have a lot of the schools that are using the same sort of text, if not the same text. So they're basically engaged in a wider conversation with each other, even if they are not necessarily interacting. And there's a very real system of honor there, where the students are, in some schools, are policing themselves because they feel that if someone acts dishonorably, it reflects on them. The flip side of this is the College of William and Mary, where the students actually have a different interpretation of honor, and they have this sort of code of silence. So the students protect the students. They have honor to each other, but not to necessarily the faculty or the president. And you actually have things where, for instance, if you've been to Colonial Williamsburg, if you know, like this sort of open area right by the governor's mansion, there is literally a pitched battle there between William and Mary students and the local townies that was led by the professor of moral philosopher who was had a few drinks. And so when he's basically accosted by politicians and the president of the school, he pulls a pistol. He's ultimately brought up before like all the powers that be, and he's not complaining that that he's brought forward. He's saying, how could you dismiss my students? I am the only one that can do that. You have besmirched my honor, sir, even though he's probably completely drunk. So he ultimately, the other interesting part, that's you can't definitively prove it, but that's probably Thomas Jefferson's first day in Williamsburg. That he either observes this or he shows up like right after it happens. So results can vary. You're still dealing with young men, but it's creating an institution where there are rules there that are policing them. So if they behave dishonorably, they are publicly shamed, literally in front of the entire school assembled. Their names would be published in the newspaper. So you would have some students that would try to, leave school and resign, saying, no, I'll resign rather than suffer this. There are actually rules put in that you cannot resign without your parents' signature in order to ensure that you face this public shaming, to basically enforce this sense of honor. And what they're building around the college easily gets repurposed and built around, an idea or a nation. But they're all reading things that are very similar: Enlightenment traditions, natural rights, the idea of something beyond an inherited birth status.
And then also, I mean, you touch on religion. I know I keep coming back to religion, but I know it was much more prevalent in society at the time. And you touched on religion throughout, particularly on your chapter about the religious teachers in these colonial colleges. Catherine Cart's Religion in America in the American Revolution and Spencer McBride's The Pulpit and the Nation detail how religious leaders in the states sermonized to bring soldiers together, bring these leaders together, officers together from disparate states, but also from similar religions, to fight for a common cause. I mean, since ancient times, leaders have claimed that on both sides of the conflict that the gods or God justify their cause. From your research, how did the church and military leaders present these precepts of honor and virtue to the citizenry and the soldiers?
So one thing to think about, early America is incredibly diverse, not necessarily in the terms of what we think of what diversity is today, but religiously diverse, ethnically diverse, extremely so, more so than anything you're going to find in Europe. So a lot of it is there are these disparate religious groups. There are splinter cells. There are various sects that may only exist in one country, but they're in some small enclave in whatever colony. So a lot of this is about speaking across these divides, and you see that very much even in the teaching from religious individuals in colleges. The idea that yes, we want to promote our particular brand of Christianity. However, if you don't have that, we'd at least prefer you have a sense of a sort of secular honor. That'll do. So you're right. Their religion does enforce this. The idea of, again, coming back to the Great Awakening, about allowing for dissent, breaking away from the king, again, which is a very real tie for many loyalists in avoiding independence, that I am not only leaving my secular head of state, but I'm leaving my connection to the divine.
Right.
So
right.
That's there. One of the best, the way I'd explain this, one of the best sources I came across in the whole book was a sermon by a chaplain to Continental Army soldiers, and this is in 1775, so before independence. And he refers to the soldiers as gentlemen soldiers. Now, that may not sound like much. Today, everyone's a gentleman. Are you a man? All right, you're a gentleman. It's it doesn't mean anything. Back then, officers were gentlemen. Soldiers were not gentlemen. In the British sense, they're like the dregs of society. There, it's like, well, there's no work for you on the farm. All right, join the army. You'll never see home again, but hey, you get a coat and some rations. So the sermon's calling them gentlemen officers, gentlemen soldiers. And it's conveying that they have a sense of honor. Something connecting them, this morality, these ethics that tie them to the nation, that tie them to each other, that need not have anything to do with a particular denomination. And what I definitely see in this period is the creation of a civic religion. That's not to say that there isn't religion, because there absolutely is. But what's uniting them is these sort of common ideals. They're ideals common of a sort of a universal aspect of, the idea these individuals may disagree on what morality means or what honor means exactly, but they don't deny that it exists. And John Adams is going to have a great line in during the Second Continental Congress. He's going to say, paraphrasing again, every day, the different regions think more and more alike in terms of words like honor and virtue, that they're starting to see this commonality. And it's really very much chaplains and other religious figures that are imparting this.
It's interesting you bring that up. I love that term, civic religion. A few weeks ago, we had Joel Paul talking about his new book, Indivisible, Daniel Webster and the Birth of Nationalism. What is nationalism? Nationalism is civic religion. I mean, that's how, just in the way you described it, it's
in a lot of ways,
it's feeling that sense of you belong to something that's not necessarily the king. You belong to each other.
And fundamentally, I mean, not to get, I'm not trying to step on the landmine that is the word exceptionalism, but the idea that in the United States, there's not a national religion.
Right.
And they're creating something, whereas this civic religion that doesn't exist elsewhere in the world at that period.
So now we have Lexington and Concord has happened, and Bunker Hill has happened, and Quebec has happened, and now we have decided there's no turning back. So in the closing line of the Declaration of Independence reads, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." What does that mean? I mean, what was my God, that now we understand. What does that mean?
I think that's a great line. But the question is, what is sacred honor? All right. So this is where I put on my literary historian beret, and I sort of analyze it. Sacred, inherently, that's religious overtones, right? You can't hide it. So this is what I'm talking about with this idea of civic religion. There's lots of different religions represented. There are lots of different regions, different beliefs. They are appealing to something, that this sense of honor, this idea of duty to a nation, to a cause, of proper conduct. And it's taking the place of religion. This is sacred. It may not be tied to, Puritanism. It may not be tied to Catholicism. It may not be tied to Anglicanism, whatever you have, but this is sacred. And this is not this is not, it's easy to say, oh, Jefferson just liked a little bit of flourish. This term has been around since the First Continental Congress. So if you look at the resolutions of the First Continental Congress in 1774, they're basically using the same terms. They're referring to sacred honor. So it's my contention that this sense of honor is what's bringing them together. So much so that they're speaking of it in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party and the Tolerable Acts. And that's what they're sticking to 2 years later when they're actually formally declaring their independence. So there's all sorts of other things going on, absolutely. Political issues, economic issues, social issues, military issues, what have you. But there's also honor there that's binding them and causing this in many respects. And that's in their own words.
So the war has begun, and now we've got to keep it together. My next program, or a program coming up, I'm interviewing Elliot Mara at Vanderbilt, who's just released a book called Disunion Among Ourselves, which I think is just a fabulous work on the political craziness that happened. But as we now are fighting the war, we are instilling upon each other this rage militaire and a reason to fight. So we recently interviewed Edward Larson on the release of his new book, American Inheritance, Liberty, Slavery, and the Birth of a Nation. The focus of his book was the moral ambiguities and hypocrisy of our founding in slavery. So a lot has transpired in our national discourse regarding the topic since your book was published 5 years ago. You present the handbook of how our founders sought to establish American ideals of honor and virtue. Would you like to give it your best shot in trying to explain how these American leaders would rail against enslavement by British tyranny while ignoring the enslavement of Africans?
All right, so I've got a section on the book on this, and obviously this has become more topical lately with, whether it's with the whole monument debate or the 1619 project or whatever group wants to ban whatever this particular week, it's when you say it, that book came out 5 years ago. It didn't seem that long ago, but
remember we had that COVID experience. Which
yeah, I want those 3 years back or whatever it was. But yeah, so things have changed in a lot of respects, and I think the question still was on, and this is something dating back to, even far back as the 1920s. Do the founders have ulterior motives, or at least to the 1970s, or certainly the 1990s, about, the hypocrisies of slavery? So here's how I'd look at it. Is there a hypocrisy between desiring liberty for yourself and still maintaining slavery? Yeah, absolutely there is. And to say otherwise, I think, is a bit of a dodge. There is hypocrisy there. The question is then, how do we understand it? How do we understand the founders' thinking? And for some of them, they are very uncomfortable with slavery. And this, you could see this in Thomas Jefferson, his famous, passage that's edited out of the Declaration of Independence about, blaming, about ending the slave trade. Granted, he blames it on the British king. But he's speaking about anti-slavery legislation even earlier than that. He's going to speak about it even after, about his views against slavery. Does he do anything? No, he absolutely nothing of consequence anyway. There are others that are going to make more greater attempts. So Washington, for instance, he's initially ardently opposed to allowing African Americans, free or enslaved, to serve in the Continental Army. He's ultimately going to change his opinion and give freedom for service. Now, this opens up to interpretations. Is this because of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which offered freedom for slaves that fought against their former masters, which is, one of the key parts of the 1619 project? Is it response to this? Or is it a response from hearing reports of valiant conduct of African Americans in and around Massachusetts that causes Washington to change it? Is it a combination of things? We know that when he dies, he's going to free slaves in his will. And in the modern context, that gets sort of pushed back on that, well, that's not doing enough. But at the same time, if you look at that document internationally, it's very much held up as a symbol of anti-slavery. Benjamin Franklin famously becomes leading abolitionist figure by the 1780s. So there is hypocrisy there, but Patrick Henry speaks out against, says he's opposed to slavery, but he claims he cannot live without slave labor. It's very much there. Lafayette's constantly speaking to Washington about this hypocrisy. There's a great historian, Francois Furstenberg, that's written a lot on this, and he makes the contention, and I think he's got something here, that a lot of the American were unwilling to see this sort of connection in the same way. The idea was, if you are deserving of liberty, you will fight for liberty. And if you do not fight for your liberty, you deserve slavery. And that is not a very PC term by the modern sense. That is not in any way just or fair, but it is part of the way how some of the American patriots viewed this. And it's going to vary by individual to individual. But if you're saying, who is the biggest hypocrite, you have to go Thomas Jefferson. Why? Jefferson is going to actually come up with his own definition of honor. It's very similar to the modern idea of conscience. And he's going to say, act as if the whole world were watching and never do a dishonorable thing. So sort of using the language of the communal, policing, but placing it only internally. So if we're applying Jefferson's own definition of honor, he fails when it comes to the issue of slavery. So the question is there hypocrisy? Yes.
Well, one of the fascinating aspects about Washington is, and why he is such a seminal character in our nation's consciousness, is that when Washington, a Tidewater gentry slaveholder, took command, I mean, he was repulsed by these New Englanders, these low-class New Englanders, as he viewed them, and having integrated regiments, only to be exacerbated by his opinions, only exacerbated his opinions. But with the evolution of the war, not only were these New Englanders and the militia, I mean, he started off the war as being wanting to lead the army like the British aristocracy.
Yes.
Aristocracy led their armies, and having only gentlemen be his officers, and yet through the war, not only did his visions, or not only did his expectations of the militia change, and he started to realize that, no, these guys really know what they're doing. These guys really working hard. They have earned their place in my army. That is honor. And the same thing with the Africans in his army, the blacks in his army. At the beginning of the war, they had no place in his army whatsoever. But by the end of the war, by Yorktown, a remarkable percentage of blacks were fighting for freedom, and Washington was able to change, and that was this new sense of American honor. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you think about it, so you have integrated ranks in the Continental Army, and you don't have it again until after World War II. Washington absolutely does change his views. We could, the idea that he is ultimately good free slaves that he owns. There's all sorts of asterisks and provisions here. He is going to change on his views on slavery. His later life, he's reading abolitionist texts. He feels he's sort of tied, that he, in his later years, he doesn't want to make a statement because he fears what will do to the nation. He literally fears civil war, and it's not really that unfounded if we know, knowing what's going to happen later on. But he absolutely is going to view a sense of, and he's going to have a line that is, any post is honorable in service of the nation. So if you are a soldier and you are serving the nation, that is honorable. If you are a woman collecting cloth to make clothing for the army, that is honorable. It wasn't just serving on the battlefield. It wasn't just being a high diplomat, in Versailles. It wasn't just being in the Continental Congress. Whatever you did to serve the nation afforded you a degree of honor. And that's what's also creating this idea of social mobility. Doesn't it create perfect equality? Absolutely not. Is there still racism and sexism? Yes. But it starts to bring other people into the sphere of, politics, into accepted in society. It's not perfect, but it's this moment that starts it. And, the idea of a contagion of liberty, or whatever, any other number of terms you may like.
Well, now that you've opened up Pandora's box, so to speak, in the Abigail Adams, let's remember the ladies.
Mhm.
How did the American Revolution transform society? It, on many levels, it did. And how did gender norms change during this era?
So you could, if you're going back to the early boycotts of the American Revolution, this is where women really come into prominence. Whether it's boycotts in response to the Stamp Act or the Tea Act or Pick Your Act, women are the leading figures in these boycotts, and largely because they are controlling what's purchased in the home. They're running the household. There's also you have examples of women policing men in their family or men that they're being courted by withholding their affections. Make of that what you will, unless they conform with the boycott. You have women in by 1774 at the Edenton Tea Party in North Carolina, literally pledging to forswear British tea. Not, and it's not for, you know, their husbands, their brothers, it's for themselves as well. It's bringing women into the political sphere, and this is recognized at the time. It's not a later, something later gone back of here's some origin points. No, it's recognized in that moment that women are serving the cause. And at least in those boycott in the early days in the 1760s, they're serving exactly as the men are. There's no distinction. There's also going to be, you know, various examples. So Deborah Sampson, I'm going to throw it out there because she's a rarity. You know, you've got Molly Pitcher, who may or may not have existed, or maybe she's two women. Who knows?
Many women.
Could be many, right?
Yeah.
Could be a composite character. Could be, you know, made up to sell pitchers of milk. I don't know.
Well, if I could, I mean, you know, I explained this because being in New Jersey, of course, we talk about Molly Pitcher a lot.
Yeah.
Molly Pitcher was many women, and they were often the camp followers who helped their husbands and brothers on the battlefield in the artillery units, and they would be they didn't know, the other artillerists didn't know their name, and they would just yell them, Molly, bring the water, or Molly Pitcher. That's where that comes from.
So we've got those examples where you've got, you know, two women, you know, Corbin Hayes, and, you know, that are sort of celebrated. But Deborah Sampson, you know, she disguised herself as a man, and she fights. She's only found out when, you know, she's wounded, and she gets full military honors. Why is that? Well, because she actually fights. You got a lot of women that attempt to do this and are sort of drummed out quite unceremoniously, but she fights, and there's a sort of a recognition of she fought for her country. It doesn't matter that she's a woman.
All right, so the headline here is that Dr. Smith blames the American Revolution on women. You know, that's it. Is that right?
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. You could say, I think a better headline is women help lead the American Revolution.
There we go. All right. So, well, so let's bring this. We've only got a few minutes left. So what happened to honor in modern day? I mean, where are we?
Well, have you? I'm willing to bet most people haven't used the term anytime, you know, recently. And maybe you're in front of a judge. Have you been in front of a judge lately? Or, you know, you're a Boy Scout or something, or Girl Scout. Where did it go? Nowhere. We just use a different word for it. Basically, in the early 20th century, so round about the World War I era, the word just sort of changes, and we no longer use the word honor in the same way. And we start using the word ethical or ethics. That word really isn't, like I said, it's not around the 18th century. It starts picking up in the early 20th century, just as the term honor starts downgrading. So if you think about today, we've got ethics for everything: medical ethics, professional ethics, you know, business ethics. All of that in the 18th century, just insert the word honor. That's how it would have been thought of.
So we have our, and what we have developed from these past 245 years is our own version of American honor. So let me throw this out at you. Sure. what do you see as the most honorable moment in American
Uh,
history?
all right. So that's an easy call for me. That's why I put on the cover of the book. And that's Washington surrendering his commission on December 23rd, 1783 in Annapolis, Maryland. Should be a national holiday, or at least a Maryland holiday, or at least a Annapolis holiday. So Washington surrenders his commission. He is a victorious military commander who does not become a Caesar. He does not become a Cromwell. He does not assume a crown, though many, in Britain and elsewhere in the world are expecting it. He's at various points, he's literally called Lord Protector Washington. And he doesn't do it. He gives up his commission. He preserves civilian supremacy. He goes back home, gives up power. It was unthinkable, not seen since the ancient world in Cincinnatus. And that becomes the basis for when we think of the modern civil-mil relations, civilian supremacy, peaceful transition of power. That's the moment. And it's recognized throughout the world. It's recognized in the moment. It's recognized for generations later. I don't think you can do better than that.
So after all the protests and all the fighting and all of the debate and all of the hypocrisy, what really changed humankind was that singular moment that defined American honor, right?
That's what I contend, and I'm working on something that's going to say literally that. So yes.
Excellent. Well, listen, I just want to tell everybody that before we began the program this evening, I was talking with Craig, and Craig, your book was recommended to me by Rick Herrera, who I don't know if you know Rick, but
I know Rick. I used to work with Rick.
okay. Rick's at the War College, and he said, you got to read this guy's book. It'll really make you think, and you'll really understand an awful lot more about the 18th century mind. And for those of us, and many in this audience, I know many of you, and many of you are regulars. It's important that not only we understand the battles and the tactics and who the biographies of these people who fought, but what they thought. And Craig's book, American Honor, The Creation of the National Ideals During the American Revolutionary Era, is highly recommended. And I urge you to pick up a copy and read it. And I think that you will be better for it. I want to thank you, Craig, for giving us an hour of your time this evening. And for everyone else, I very much appreciate always your joining me on these programs for these shows. Keep your eye out at historyauthortalks.com to see our next program. And remember, keep reading. And thank you all very much. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Great, Greg. Terrific.
Oh, happy to do it. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to take a question or two. That's fine with me. I don't want to, I'm not going to dash on everyone.
Well, if we do have a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
I ended the show, but let's go to some of the questions that we have here. Hang on a second. Let me get.
I see one from Monica Kravitz.
Yeah. How well was one educated player a role in leadership in the small New England town, and also in the South? Honor and ethics comes with education.
Yeah. No, so obviously, the more prominent you were in the town, you usually gave a leadership position, especially in the New England militias, where they elect their officers. So if you could afford to supply the beer for the local muster, well, I'm willing to bet you're going to become that captain. But again, it's largely perceived of the idea of gentlemen are supposed to lead. So if you're seen as of this genteel status, you're going to find it's going to be deemed both expected of you, and you're going to expect it of yourself. And the South, again, it's more of the it's more ingrained. It's sort of this familial idea that's going to sort of follow this older British folk way. And if you get out to sort of the back countries of, let's say, you know, of what we think of as Appalachia, think about sort of Scottish and Irish sort of clan senses of honor.
Mhm.
That's very much grafted there. Okay, so Kelsa, you
Okay.
asked a question.
Yeah, considering the community aspect of tied to honor, do you see that playing out in the do you see that playing out in the Boston Tea Party, especially considering the separateness of virtue and honor in the North?
Okay, that's a really good question. And what Kelsa is trying to get at is you don't talk as much about the Boston Tea Party in your book as you do the other things. That's what she's getting at. So I think yes, but it's more open to interpretation. So the idea of taxes or infringements on rights are viewed as affronts to honor. So yes, in that respect, I would say yes, it is there. What does that allow you to do now? That's a question. And this is where it gets open to interpretation, especially between the sort of Sons of Liberty types, the more firebrand, rabble-rouser types, and your more gentlemanly revolutionaries like George Washington. Can you use violence? Can you intimidate people? And Washington's very much opposed to this in the early days, during the Stamp Act. But when we get to the Boston Massacre, there's very much resistance to the way the colonists respond there. But when we get to the Tea Party, it gets a little grayer. Is that violence? Is it just destruction of property in protest? So that's very much going to vary who you ask. So for the Sons of Liberty sort, yes, honor is involved. Our rights have been infringed upon. This tax is putting us to a servile tributary status. We must respond. Versus others, should we not be doing this in a more moral, more ideological way to show that we American patriots are morally superior to the British, that we have our honor, they do not. So that one, I think, really depends who you ask and where you are. But regardless of where you stood in the Boston Massacre, what unites the colonies, it's the British response to the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts. That's what brings everyone together. So even though you may not have agreed with the methods, Britain shows itself that it no longer has the honor it once did. And that's when we get the First Continental Congress, and that's where we get the sacred honor. And I'm glad you agree with me, Kelsa.
That's great. All right. Well, listen, thanks so much, Craig. And
happy to do it.
Questions, and good night, everybody. We will see you next time. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.